Well, I will begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Soy Toolkit interview. Today, we'll be interviewing Rachael Sherman, who is the Director of Global Sustainability at McDonald's Corporation. Um, I'm here over Zoom, so we're speaking virtually today with me, myself, Rob Bales, Deputy Director at ProForest in our responsible sourcing team, based in London, and Rachael over the pond in New York. And thank you to everybody in advance for bearing with us should we experience any technology glitches or audio delays. Rachael, before we get started, I was hoping you could give our listeners a brief introduction to your role at McDonald's and as that relates to soy and soy supply chains.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for inviting me to participate. So at McDonald's, I'm on our global sustainability team. McDonald's operates in 100 and more than 120 countries around the world, and we have about 70 million people coming into our restaurants around the world every day. So on the global team, we're looking at suppliers that supply multiple countries around the world and working to make sure that our standards in place across our global system. And in my role, I lead our work on palm oil sustainability as well as coffee sustainability. And then I work closely with ProForest on our commitment on forests. So that commitment covers a number of commodities. 2020, we're focusing on beef, palm oil, coffee, fiber, and then soy in our chicken supply chain. And for 2030, we'll expand that work on soy to our anywhere soy touches our supply chain footprint, as well as other commodities. So every day I'm working with partners like ProForest, NGOs that we work with, like the World Wildlife Fund, our suppliers, our internal supply chain team, and then people that work at McDonald's around the world.
Thank you very much. And it's great, of course, to have you here with us today. We will be speaking to Rachael today about her experience, learnings, and recommendations on working to establish responsible supply chains. And soy is, of course, as many of us will know, one of the largest expanding global crops and has been the largest expanding global crop over recent years. And there is naturally concern that parts of the supply chain and production of soy are linked to deforestation, land rights, and human rights abuses, and of course, the destruction of critically important landscapes and habitats. In response to this, ProForest, with the support of our partners, WWF and the Global Environment Facility, have been developing something called the Soy Toolkit. And that is a one stop shop to help companies develop and implement and advance their sustainable soy sourcing commitments. So, without any further ado, I would like to dive into our interview with Rachael today. And may I start, Rachael, by doing just asking you to give us a little bit more detail about your role as Director of Global Sustainability at McDonald's, but specifically with regards to your commitments on soy and your soy implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. So our my role in sustainability for soy is really connected with our commitment on forests. So our commitment has both environmental and social criteria that we want to ensure um, that are met in our supply chain. And so my role is essentially to make sure that McDonald's has standards and procedures in place to be able to meet our commitment on forests. And what that looks like in practice is understanding what companies can do to make sure that our supply chain, we can make claims that we're free of deforestation or that our commitment on forests is being met, and then integrating those procedures into the way that we purchase products. So we, it includes things like working with our buyers of commodities that have soy in the footprint to understand which suppliers we should be working with. So that might be someone who buys chicken, for example. And then it would be working with people like our quality systems department who manage things like our raw material specifications to understand how we can embed our expectations into those policies. And then there's work around communicating what we're doing and making sure that we can not only address our supply chain, but drive change beyond our supply chain. So that means meeting with suppliers and setting our expectations, joining forums like the Tropical Forest Alliance to communicate McDonald's position. So there's a lot of work involved day to day that looks a little bit different, but those are some of the major areas that I would be that I would be doing to make sure our commitment comes to life in our supply chains globally.
Thanks. And of course, McDonald's is committed to eliminating deforestation in its global supply chains by 2030. And that commitment applies to commodities such as beef, chicken, and palm oil. What role does soy specifically play in your supply chains? And I suppose related to that, how significant is soy for you as a commodity?
Yeah, so um, part of the work I didn't mention is, which is actually quite significant for any company, but especially a company of our size, is just to understand what your footprint is. And coming up with that calculation is more difficult than you might expect at the outset. And so a lot of work goes into being able to answer the question that you just asked. And I think it's important to mention that McDonald's doesn't actually produce or manufacture any food. So whenever we're doing this work, we're working with suppliers who sell food into McDonald's restaurants, and we need to work with them to understand what the footprint looks like. And for soy, it's especially complicated because we're not generally buying soy directly. We do use some in our restaurant cooking oil, but that isn't the majority of soy usage. We use much more soy as an embedded product, as animal feed in some of our meat supply chains. And so, of the meat supply chains, based on what we know so far, chicken is the biggest majority of our soy usage. So, more than half of the soy we use as a company is sitting in our chicken supply chain as feed, and that's why we're prioritizing our work on chicken. And then, in terms of how soy fits as a commodity in terms of impact, it is in terms of volume, it's the second most important. So beef for us is the largest by far in terms of how much we purchase. And so we're putting a lot of effort and focus on beef. And then soy is the second largest. And it's a little bit different from beef because, again, we don't purchase it directly, whereas beef, we buy it more directly. It's not used just as an ingredient. So as we look forward, just to reiterate, so soy is probably the second biggest in terms of volume. And then when we look at soy, chicken is the biggest area where we need to examine our supply chain. And after we've come up with solutions for chicken, we'll look at other areas where there's embedded soy. So dairy, eggs, beef in some places as feed, pork. So there's a lot of areas where we'll have to look into how we use soy after 2020.
That's really helpful background and context there, I think. In addition to the actions that you're taking as a business within your supply chain, are there any other actions or activities, programs that you'd like to highlight which are part of the broader effort to address sustainability challenges? And why are those important to the McDonald's business?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are working. I strongly believe that McDonald's has a commitment to ensure that our commitment on forest is being met in our supply chain, which we can operationalize, we can communicate and report on transparently. But even if we meet our commitment as a company, we may continue to see deforestation in these high priority areas. And our ultimate goal is to stop deforestation. And we know we need to do that because of the climate impacts, because of the people and the animals that rely on forests. This is important to our business, and we want to focus on that larger impact, not only our supply chain metrics. And that's why we engage in these industry partnerships, because without moving the whole industry, having government involved, civil society, without doing that work, we won't make the change we need on the bigger issue. So, so we do that in a number of ways. We try to participate and use our brand, our position as a consumer-facing company, our communications abilities to send a market signal that this is important in our supply chain and that we care about it as a company, and that our customers, our investors are asking us to do this. So it's important to our stakeholders. And specifically the places that we do that is we engage in multi-stakeholder platforms. Um, I think I mentioned already, but for soy and other commodities, we're active in the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is a great forum that brings together private sector, nonprofits, and governments, which is a really important connection that can be difficult to do as a company alone. And we also engage in other forums like the Collaboration on Forests and Agriculture that's being led by the World Wildlife Fund and a group of other NGOs. Um, and then on soy, we were really proud to be involved in the soy moratorium when it was put in place in Brazil. So, representing retailers who support the soy moratorium in the Amazon biome. And then we supported that agreement as it was continued indefinitely. So, that's an example of how this kind of multi stakeholder platform can drive real reductions in deforestation rates. And we hope that that kind of work continues.
Yeah, very interesting. And Rachel, if I may, just how mature do you think some of these sectoral collaborations are? Do you think there's more work that needs to be done? How far do you think that those are in achieving the sorts of sectoral objectives that we're looking to achieve?
Yeah, I think the indicator is how much deforestation continues to happen. And we're seeing that those rates are down from previous years, which is great, but still on the rise compared to recent years. So I think we need to focus on that metric, and that tells us that we still have more work to do. But having said that, I think the platforms are much more mature than they were a few years ago. There are a lot of people and companies involved and governments involved. And one thing that gives me hope is that I see them focusing a lot on action. So not only about talking and meeting, which is very important, but also on what concrete actions can every member of the platform take, as well as setting outcome-based targets, which I think is very important.
Mm. And changing tack slightly and maybe taking a step back, what are the drivers for McDonald's and indeed other companies for setting these commitments and for implementing those commitments in the supply chain?
And by drivers, you mean the reasons why we set these commitments?
Exactly, the
Yeah.
motivations. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that it comes from we set our commitment on forests in 2014 after we signed the New York Declaration on forests, and that came out of conversations around climate. So one of the reasons that we know it's important, I think the most essential, is that if we don't address the impacts of climate change, we won't be able to serve food in the future. And we're a food business. And so at its core, it's about resiliency and making sure that our supply chain is strong in the face of crises. And I think the COVID-19 crisis showed us how fragile food supply chains may be. And we know that there's more shocks to the system coming with the impacts of climate change. So if anything, the importance of these issues has only risen over time, which I think is good that companies continue to see it as very important. So that is a kind of basic reason that we do it, but we also do it because our stakeholders tell us that this is important to them. So we know that it's important to our customers. Our investors regularly ask us about deforestation specifically and also related issues like human rights and climate change. Um, and that pressure from civil society, from investors, from customers hasn't stopped. It's very consistent. And so it was the reason we set up the commitment in the first place. And it's also the reason that we continue to make progress. And we'll look at this seriously over time. So I think once McDonald's sets a goal, we're very serious about meeting our goals, but we also have this continued pressure and kind of noise that this is important for all of our stakeholders.
That's very interesting. Now, of course, McDonald's, and I think you communicated there the date way back to 2014-15 when the New York Declaration on Forests was announced and developed, and of course, lots of companies have announced their no deforestation policies and objectives. And so, McDonald's has been at this for some time now, for a number of years.
Mhm.
In that time, what are some of the practical lessons that the business has learnt um, as you've sought to implement your commitments?
Yes, it's been quite a journey. And we started, the when we set these commitments, it was, and it still is in some ways, but very aspirational. And we did not have a template of how to do this work. So a lot of work that's been done on creating definitions, for example, and guidance for companies through groups like the Accountability Framework, which I think is fantastic, didn't exist a few years ago. And so it really has been a journey where we've had to sort of jump in and try different things and see what worked, and it led to some innovative solutions. So it's been a really helpful process, but there has been a lot of work involved. So there's a few key lessons that have come out of it for me. One of the most important is to work with partners locally in the regions that the food is being produced, because this isn't about a global multinational, company telling people in Brazil, for example, how to produce food. This is about listening to people locally so that we can tailor our expectations for what the reality is in that location. And one of the reasons we work with ProForest is because you have a strong local office in Brazil. We have people who are speaking English and Portuguese and Spanish, and so we can engage with local stakeholders. I think that's really important. We also work with AgroTools, which is a Brazilian ag tech company, who helps us do some of uh, the data and mapping and the technical sides that gives us the supply chain insights that we need. And then we work with local, our suppliers, obviously, producer groups, and then also local civil society groups like NGOs that give us insights at the local level. And then we communicate that knowledge across so we can learn between countries and at a global scale. But it's not about that sort of global, trying to find a one size fits all band aid to locally relevant issues. Um, and then I guess another takeaway is that even a company as big as McDonald's cannot do this work alone. It takes a huge amount of partnership, and we might report progress in one, metric, but actually it takes a ton of people, from the farmer to our suppliers to all of the external groups, including ProForest that I mentioned, and all the multi-stakeholder platforms. There are many, many people involved in making any of this change. So that partnership outside of the business and then inside the business is very important as well. So when I work at McDonald's, I'm working with buyers of food, people who work in our treasury department, people who work in our legal team, people who are specialized in food safety. Everyone is involved, and it really is a collaborative effort, to get this work done.
So now, given all of those lessons, I wonder it would be interesting to hear your view on what has been the biggest challenge, or maybe if you reverse 10 years, go back 10 years, and say one of the things that you thought might be easy has actually proved to be the hardest. Be interested to hear.
Well, you would think I think that there are two things that are the biggest challenges. The first is making a market mechanism that is effective for sustaining the change we want. So the biggest challenge still today is that a lot of the deforestation that is occurring is illegal. So making sure that we have anything illegal out of our supply chain is something obvious that we need to work on, but it requires local regulations and follow up and assurance. But legal deforestation, where people have the right to deforest, and the ones who are not are providing services to the marketplace, ecosystem services to society in the marketplace, and the financial reward for that isn't yet clear. So I think that debate is still one that needs to be resolved, and is a big ongoing issue. And then in terms of McDonald's work specifically, you would think that understanding, we talked about this earlier, understanding how much soy we use would be easy. But actually, it took us years and years and a lot of resources and work to get an accurate picture of of how much soy we use. And part of the reason that's challenging is because um, of of soy being an ingredient, right? So we're not just purchasing soy directly. We don't have the specific volumes. And then when you start looking at how soy is used in a global chicken supply chain, it becomes even more complicated because the soy used in a European chicken supply chain um, may be coming from different sources than a US chicken supply chain, for example. And then the way that chicken is raised is different in Thailand than it is in Brazil. And so we need to look at how much soy a chicken eats throughout its lifetime, and then what different types of chicken products we use in different parts of the world, and that all changes how much soy is used. So we had to do a lot of research to understand the trade flows of soy because that traceability isn't there yet today. And then we had to do a lot of work to create a calculator, which AgriTools helped us with and ProForest also supported, to be able to get an accurate picture of the soy in our supply chain. So now we know not an estimation, not based on academic research, but based on a commercial supply chain at a global scale, how much soy we use in our chicken supply chain. But that was a big challenge. We're there now, and hopefully other companies can leverage some of what we've done. But it was definitely harder than we thought at the outset.
So McDonald's is and does report now on its global soy footprint.
Well, it's taken us a long time, so we will be reporting this year, but we have been reporting estimates, and now we'll be reporting a much more accurate picture going forward. So we report on CDP through CDP Forests, and then we'll also be reporting on our website on our Commitment on Forest page.
That's great. So there's obviously a lot of work that has been going on there to do that, an enormous amount of work, very complex, very detailed. How do you, as a business, communicate that work and share those lessons with other companies at different stages in their supply chains, who may not be as far down that or along that journey as McDonald's is?
Yeah, so we do. Um, at the most basic, we communicate through the platforms I mentioned. So our website is always a place that will post updates, and platforms like CDP we think are really important for reporting. And it's great that there are places where companies can report consistently so that stakeholders can compare what companies are doing and that companies have consistency for year on year reporting. And then we also report in other um, or share our learnings in other ways. So interviews like this is one example. Speaking at different conferences, especially those multi-stakeholder platforms we talked about, like the Tropical Forest Alliance and others. And then we're working on publishing some of the findings of the work we've done through different white papers. Um, we're working with ProForest to be included in a Soy Toolkit case study where we share a little bit more detail on the work we've done. And then we also do things in person um, on the in different locations, which has been really helpful for us to be able to share what we've learned, but then also to get feedback from others. So we were happy to host a workshop in November in 2019 in Sao Paulo, where we invited people from the Brazilian agriculture industry, from academic institutions, from nonprofits, and our suppliers were there. And we presented in a lot of detail the work that we've done on soy so that we could share with other companies, but then also get feedback from them. And so that was a great way, that kind of workshop was something we'll continue doing, but it was a great way for us to share what we've been doing and then evolve the work as well. So those are some of the different areas where we're communicating our progress.
That's really exciting, Rachel. Thanks, and almost concludes our interview. But I was wondering whether there was just anything you wanted to communicate with our readers about where McDonald's goes next. What does the next, say, 2 to 3 to 5 years look like, given where you have got to date?
Yes, well, we have a lot of work left to do. As I said, we had the 2020 commitment that focused on our 5 key commodities. Those are our biggest impacts in terms of volume and where we're sourcing. And then we have a 2030 commitment to expand this work to our entire supply chain. And our entire supply chain is quite large and complex, so there'll be a lot of work to do to make sure that we meet our commitments in our supply chain. And then the other area is right, addressing the bigger issue that we actually halt deforestation, which is the point of the work we're doing. And so thinking about engaging in the ways we have been engaging, but then also looking at, are there new things that we should be doing to try to tackle this issue? If what we've been doing the last 5 or 10 years hasn't been successful in getting the outcomes we want, are there new things that we want to work on, new partnerships, new mechanisms maybe to test that we could try? And one area that we're looking at, for example, is we rely on soy as a protein in our chicken supply chain, but there are ways to replace that protein with other sources. So working with our suppliers, Cargill in this instance has been helping us test alternative proteins in the chicken supply chain. So we're doing research into using algae and insects in chicken supply chain as a replacement for soy. So commercializing, bringing that to scale would be another area that we're looking at, kind of looking at the problem in a different lens as well.
Thank you. That's really interesting. All that leaves for me to say is thank you very much, Rachel. That does close our interview today. It's been really interesting to hear about your sustainability commitments and the work the business has been doing to implement those commitments. And we hope through the medium of this interview today that can be of some benefit to other companies who are looking to start their journey or continue implementing their commitments in soy. If I may, I would just like to flag that as part of the Soy Toolkit and the work that we Proforest have been doing, we are offering free of charge training for sourcing and sustainability teams who are looking to access further support with responsible soy. And so please, if you are interested in that, do get in contact with us, and you can email us there at soytoolkit@proforest.net, and we will be in touch with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rob.